Well, good afternoon. Welcome to join us online today in such a beautiful afternoon in Seattle. I'm Man Wang, Director at the Washington State-China Relations Council. In today's webinar, we'll look at employment essentials for companies and talents in the US and China. We think this is an important topic, but not well understood by both employers and employees operating in a foreign country. So we're delighted to have two experienced employment and cross-border attorneys to share their insights on some of the key elements and the common mistakes with regard to employment, including hiring, firing, and operation process, etc. I do see some familiar names in the registration list. So just in case you don't know about our organization, please allow me to give you a brief introduction. The Washington State-China Relations Council, or the WCCRC, was founded in 1979 and is the oldest state-level nonprofit organization promoting improved bilateral relations with China. WCRC serves as a thought leader on US-China issues. We curate programs to improve mutual understanding. And we're also a nexus for business and government leaders on both sides of the Pacific. We're a membership-based organization, and our membership comprises of companies, ports, government agencies, financial institutions, higher education institutions, law firms, and also cultural organizations. If you'd like to know more about us, please feel free to email us or visit our website at www.wscrc.org. You've seen our speakers' bio on our event announcement, so just let me briefly introduce our speakers and moderator here. Grace Young is of counsel at Littler Mendelson PC. Her work at Littler primarily focuses on US and China matters, as well as global projects. Grace has considerable experience advising clients on complex employment and international law issues in a wide range of industries. She has served as a general outside counsel to many businesses, especially those that have overseas operations or are expanding into foreign legal jurisdictions. She has written extensively about important cutting-edge employment law issues that may impact multinational employers, including authoring a comprehensive book on employment law in China. Grace is a graduate of the Peking University School of Law and holds a JD degree from the University of Washington School of Law. She's a member of the bar in Washington and New York. We also have Yuping Wang, who's the founding partner of WIP Law, PLLC. Before establishing WIP Law in October 2022, Yuping worked at Davis Red Tremaine LLP for 30 years, both as in-house counsel and partner. At Davis Red Tremaine, Yuping advised US and Chinese companies on their establishment and operations across the Pacific, and US and Chinese individuals on cross-border investments and family businesses. Now, through the work of WIP Law, Yuping is committed to helping and offering affordable legal services to individuals and small, medium-sized enterprises. Our moderator today is Nora Kokiard, Executive Director of the Washington State-China Relations Council. Nora spent 35 years living and working in Asia, including serving as the country CEO for Cargill in Korea, Japan, and China. He served as the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai in 2008 and 2009, nor also provided leadership to several international nonprofit organizations, as well as CEO leadership groups. Before I turn it over to Nor, allow me to go over some housekeeping items. Please make sure to stay muted throughout the session. We'll start the discussion with moderator questions for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then answer questions from the audience. If you have questions for the speakers, please type them in the chat box. We'll collect them and try to get them all addressed during the audience Q&A session. Please note that this discussion is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel and our website. I'll post our channel's link in the chat box momentarily. You can also find some of our past event recordings there too. I'd like to draw your attention that our next webinar will be on March 22nd. We'll look at the impacts of the US-China relationship on Southeast Asia, some of the Southeast Asia countries. A Seattle-based China watcher will share his insights from a recent trip to Southeast Asia that comprised of multiple meetings with government officials, think tanks and academia, journalists, and also US and other foreign embassies in the region. We'll post detailed event information next week, and please watch for our announcement in your email. Noor, over to you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think Mon and I have been working out so much it slipped her mind. We also have another event coming up on March 7th, and that's going to be about APEC. And quite frankly, the APEC ministerial meetings are going to be in Seattle from the end of July almost to the end of August. And there's going to be a whole host of meetings: health, food safety, women's economy, small and medium ministry, disaster planning. There's all kinds of things that are going to happen during the month of August with APEC here. And on March 7th, we're going to have the leader of the National Committee on APEC, who's based here in Seattle, talk to us about what's going to happen. So I think it'll probably be the most definitive session yet, because there hasn't been much in the press at all about what's going to happen with the APEC process in Seattle this summer. So that's on March 7th, and I think if you're interested in that topic, you'll want to participate in that one. So I know Mon and I have been working on a lot, and it must have just slipped her mind.
Noor, thank you for.
Right.
So actually, I just sent the announcement to someone before this webinar, so I don't know why I forgot. So
right.
Thank you.
Anyway, okay, let's move on to the appointment one. So again, Grace and Yuping, thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm going to start with Grace. I'm going to ask her to kind of set the stage a little bit, to give us a little bit of a global perspective on employment issues. All countries aren't the same. Are there some major differences between particularly China and the US that we should be aware of before we get into a little more nitty-gritty stuff? So Grace, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Mon. Thank you, Noor. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate everyone taking the time to participate in today's program. So as Mon mentioned in my bio, I am a US and China advisor, and I also work on global employment matters. And on the global projects, I normally work with American companies that are operating globally with respect to their labor and employment matters. On a global scale, US is very unique. It is the only country in the whole wide world that has the concept or doctrine of employment at will. So if there's only one takeaway for you today from me, that will be US has employment at will. And what does that mean? It basically means that employers are generally free to terminating the employment of an employee for any reason or for no reason at all, with or without notice. And employees are free to quit at any time. This exists in nearly every state in the United States, except Montana. So as a result of the employment at will doctrine, termination is generally easy in the US. So when I normally work with American clients on nowadays, we've been doing a lot of global reduction in force projects, and my American clients are usually not too worried about terminating or laying off people in the US. They're more concerned about other jurisdictions outside the US. The employment laws are very different among different countries. I mean, for a lot of reasons, political reasons, economic, social reasons, etc. For example, in the global reduction in force projects, from the get-go, we see a lot of differences. For example, what triggers a collective dismissal or mass layoff, that differs between different countries. And in the US, normally statutory severance is not required. We know, I mean, Yuping will probably talk more about this. China is different. Severance is required in most termination situations. And there are usually certain categories of employees that are protected by the statute from a layoff. But that does not really exist in the US. And in the US, there's generally no duty to consult with employees or their representatives, versus in many other countries, you know, if you're going to make someone redundant, you need to consult with them and talk to them about any alternative to lay off before the company can go ahead with the redundancy decision. So in the US, it's very normal to see that the company will announce that we have made the difficult decision to restructure, to lay off people. But in many other countries, you cannot say that a decision, like a final decision, has been made. It has to be, it has to go through consultation and whatever other requirements that are mandated by law. And of course, in many other countries, local language documents are required, or any hearings or consultation need to be conducted in the local language. Otherwise, the whole document or the whole communication can be deemed invalid. And in terms of differences, we cannot just think about continent. Why I mention this? Because, for example, in Asia, Singapore and Hong Kong are fairly straightforward when it comes to pretty much everything related to employment law, and especially with respect to termination. But China is completely different. Termination is generally difficult in China. And just one more thing I want to mention, because it's I mean, I could go on and on about, you know, US and versus other countries, the differences in employment law, but this is significant, so I wanted to just briefly point out that so in other countries, for example, China and a lot of other countries, there are a lot of public schemes like public pension, public health insurance, and publicly mandated holidays and vacation days. In the US, it's predominantly like a private system. So what the employers need to do is to, among other things, weigh the advantages, the pros and cons of offering specific benefits. So that's kind of an overall of differences between different jurisdictions in the employment context.
Great, thank you for that. Before, I'm going to ask Yuping a little later to talk a little bit about how China does some of their labor laws, and particularly vis-a-vis the US. But Grace, while I've got you, you've helped Chinese companies set up in the US. So I guess to start with, what have they had to grapple with, you know, vis-a-vis running a business in China, and maybe some examples of what they've done right. We may get to later on, we might get to what some of the common mistakes were, but what do Chinese companies have to deal with when they're setting up here?
Sure, there are a lot of challenges for foreign employers, and in particular Chinese employers, that they encounter when they first come to the US. Well, first of all, the cultural differences. The culture is just so different, and I guess starting with the at-will concept, that, you know, China doesn't really have the at-will employment concept. Here, it's easy to terminate someone, but termination requires careful consideration and planning beforehand. Just because it has an employment at will doesn't mean it doesn't come with risks, and especially litigation risks. And on the other hand, companies need to sort of preserve the at-will nature of the employment relationship to have that flexibility to terminate someone for any reason and at any time. And companies need to train their managers on how complex how complex terminations can be in the US. And there are just so many sort of US unique or concepts or just in the US employment law that Chinese companies do not typically see in China. For example, I mean, in China, there's the general protection against discrimination based on one's religious belief, but the law kind of stops there. In the US, not only do we have that, employers also have the obligations to accommodate employees' religious. So there's the religious accommodation obligations, and now we see, Washington has Washington's new pay transparency law has come into effect on January 1st, 2023, and that just has created a lot of headaches or concerns for employers, especially with respect to job posting requirements. And we don't really have that in China. And Washington's not just the only jurisdiction that has pay equity and transparency law. And speaking of cultural differences, I have to mention the litigation culture in the US. So it's very frequent for employers, for companies to get sued in the US, and people apparently love to sue. And we see almost every day discrimination, retaliation, wrongful termination, lawsuits. And these are, the laws are very different in those regards in China: discrimination, whistleblower protection, or and wrongful termination. So that's very different. And also don't forget wage and hours lawsuits are very common, and class action lawsuits. That's kind of rare in China, but very common in the US. And another thing is the US has very different from China is the multi-layered labor and employment law system. And so most employment related activities are involve several sets of laws: federal, state, and local. And that's very different from China and a lot of other jurisdictions. And in some countries, all the employer needs to do is to comply with the national law. But in the US, just because someone complies with federal doesn't mean they're in compliance with state or local. And you don't forget their county, city laws. So it's very complicated. And when working with foreign employers coming to the US for the first time, this has come up many times. Many of them did not realize that Washington State is different from Washington, D.C. They thought they were the same thing. So it's a challenge to adapt to the local, not only the local laws and several layers of local laws and federal, state, and local, and also the local practices. I wanted to mention the remote environment because this has come up for Chinese companies, and the remote and hybrid. There are many things to consider in today's remote or hybrid environment. There's the how to manage employees' work time, and especially for non-exempt employees. And by non-exempt employees, I mean hourly, non-salaried exempt employees who are basically entitled to overtime pay if they work overtime. And salary employees, they're exempt from overtime pay and they normally receive a salary. And commonly they mean professionals, administrative, and outside sales jobs. And of course, attorneys are were normally salary exempt employees. And we have this, and of course, expense reimbursement. That's a huge consideration in today's remote and hybrid environment. And we also have this wandering worker phenomenon today, that people are not just working from home, they're working from everywhere. So it's important for employers to know and document where the employees are working from, to comply with many laws, and especially wage and hour laws, which are super complex. And I also wanted to mention, so it's one challenge is many clients, when they foreign employers, when they first came to the US, they didn't realize the necessity or the importance of hiring experts to help them in the specific areas where they need help. Why do I mention this? Because, for example, we say LE, labor and employment, but actually labor and employment are very different things. And labor usually, we're talking about collective bargaining in, say, like in a unionized environment, and labor contract administration, strike, or unfair labor practices. I've seen clients, they have great employment attorneys, but they don't have good labor attorneys. So when there's a union concern or any traditional labor stuff comes into play, and then they can end up struggling because they don't have a labor attorney.
Right. Okay. So yeah, Grace, I want to move on. I want to make sure Yuping gets to tell us a little bit more about China too. So
sorry, I get excited about this kind of stuff, kind of a comparative law nerd, but I'll stop now.
Okay, so thank you. And this thing about wandering employees, I mean, that implies US, China, probably all over the world today. So Yuping, can you tell us a little bit, about Chinese labor laws from the perspective of particularly an American company going to China? What challenges do they face?
Okay.
Can you outline a few of those?
Yeah, Greece did a very good summary of the comparison. There are a lot of differences. Like Greece mentioned about, is there is pretty much no discrimination, retaliation cases in China. And Greece also mentioned about trade union, but trade union in China is generally less hostile to employers. So when US companies come to China, they actually try to take their employment practice, their values, and even sometimes they take their US HR managers to China. So I personally think that it may not be a good practice to take your own US HR manager to China because of the so many differences and a lot of differences. Some of the differences are written in law, but some of them actually are purely societal differences, which are very difficult for them to comprehend. Generally speaking, US companies in China are good corporate citizens and they try their best to be in compliance, but sometimes actually they rely too much on legal advisors, because as lawyers, we can only see which is legal. We cannot say something which is now legal, but you can still do it because you have no penalty. And also, in my own practice, actually, I feel some of the US companies, the people who make decisions at a very senior level, like sometimes they are expatriates, they are senior HR directors, they don't speak Chinese, so they can only talk to their senior assistants who help them to explain. But there is a big gap between them and the local Chinese workers, some employees who don't speak English. So basically that has made their job very superficial. And so, yeah. But so here, actually, I won't spend time to talk more about the comparison. So, but as Grace mentioned about, is termination is a big difference. China has no termination at will. And also China has the nationwide law, which govern pretty much everything. Only some issues like minimum pay, sick leave, maternity leave, those are the issues by local laws. And also litigation in China is not that costly. So don't afraid of go to court in China for labor issues.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, I'll get back to you, I think, in a little while. We want to talk a little bit about some examples, so people kind of hear some of the issues in real life, on the ground sort of things. That the companies have experienced. So Grace, let's circle back to you and say, okay, so we've seen some of these movies and stories. What are a couple of real life examples of problems that Chinese companies have run into?
Sure.
In the US.
Yeah. So as I think Yuping mentioned that, one mistake that foreign employers and especially Chinese companies make coming to the US is kind of just take their employee handbooks or whatever employer policies they want to apply and simply translate them without checking with experienced local counsel. And one example is, and this could set the employer up for a lot of legal trouble and oftentimes discrimination lawsuits and other regulatory risks as well. For example, it's kind of common to have a policy that sort of requires managers to hire certain people to promote diversity, and we call them affirmative positive discrimination, and this is usually not okay in the US, but typically in China actually has laws about promoting hiring people with disabilities, and so when employers just sort of translate the policies and present them to their US employees, that's where a kind of trouble happens. And another thing that has led to litigation is sort of to let the national origin play a role in employment decisions, especially regarding career advancement within the organization. So we usually tell our Chinese clients to be very careful in this regard and not let the national origin and sometimes, I mean, in the state-owned enterprise context, party membership could play a role in employment decisions. And if that happens in the US, it's almost guaranteed there's going to be a discrimination lawsuit. And as I mentioned, discrimination lawsuits happen very often. And another thing is not engaging outside help from legal counsels sort of early on, and this can actually happens a lot in sexual harassment cases. For example, companies, there's a alleged sexual harassment, and company sort of well, and then the alleged victim files a police report, and the company then does nothing and sort of just let the police investigation play out. That's kind of a no-no because the standard for police investigation is very different and also just separate from what the company should do to deal with this type of situation. And another kind of no-no is to have an in-house HR generalist conduct an investigation on this sexual harassment or similar situation. We've seen cases where the client had their in-house HR generalist conduct the investigation and decided the evidence was inconclusive, and then an external investigator was hired and found a bunch of evidence confirming that actually sexual harassment did take place. And so that's going to be a big problem, but can be prevented if outside help is brought in early on instead of not too deep into it. And another thing that has come up for Chinese companies, or sort of like a common mistake, is not apply the employment policies consistently, because someone could be someone's friend, and we know that the people's relationship is very different in general in the US versus in China. In the US, we're expected to act as professionals and have formulate this professional relationship among colleagues. And in China, people are usually considered like friends and extended families when they're at work, and so it could set the company up for discrimination lawsuits, and also has come up in situations where something is told to someone verbally because they consider themselves like siblings or family, friends, and not documented in writing properly. It could lead to disputes down the road, and another thing.
Well, great, Grace. Let's switch back to China. So we want to make sure Yuping gets some examples in.
It's
So,
okay.
Yeah, no, but Yuping, I know people. There's some people on the call. I know, like Jeff. He manages an office in China, but he's sitting here in the U.S. So I'm sure he's curious about how some of these things happen. So some examples of maybe common mistakes U.S. companies have made. I mean, one I'll just point out, when I ran our company in China, I mean, the benefits for Chinese employees, sometimes the benefits were like 60% of their base salary, different pension plans, medical plans, et cetera, et cetera. And we knew that our Chinese competitors weren't paying these things, they're paying minimal.
Yeah.
So there was an example where we were uncompetitive if we followed the law, but if you're a US based company, you're a very legalistic point of viewpoint. So you mentioned earlier, there's the law and then there's the practice, but how do American companies navigate in that kind of situation?
Yeah, it's basically US companies, they try to be in fully compliance. So also as lawyers, we can only tell them what is lawful. So for example, like the social benefits, local Chinese companies, it's very popular for them to have a big salary, which is very low, and they have another position salary. So they pay all the social benefits and also sometimes the personal income tax based on the lower base salary rather than the total compensation. So that substantially lower their expenses. But US company, US managers like you know the practice, but you still choose to be in full compliance, which I feel very respectful. But if you want to do a little bit, you want to reduce some of your cost, you still can do it as long as you make it something in writing, as long as you prepare all the documents, you let employees sign whatever the documents and the policies you have. You actually it's still doable, but some managers, you don't want to do it because you don't want to have trouble. But this social benefits is extra cost. But US company has some advantages, actually, like, when you were in China, perhaps you pay less income, personal income tax than a local Chinese with the same amount of compensation. So it's actually a trade-off. And like other things I mentioned about is is sometimes you don't, foreign US companies, they don't trust the local team. They actually they want to take control of everything. They think that what they know, what they are doing in the US is the best. So they don't want to change. So Grace also mentioned about employment handbook. Like in my case, some of the US companies, they want to use the US handbook to apply to China, which is, to me, is a disaster. And there was one case, I don't know whether I mentioned to you, is one of the very senior US HR manager. She asked us to say, okay, in China, I have employees in several different cities. I want to apply the same sick leave policies. I want to apply the same maternity leave policies to all my employees in China. And she wants us to put in writing to summarize the policies. Then this is a case that we have to say, no, this is a very stupid idea. Even if she's very senior, traditionally as lawyers, we want to please our clients. We want to do whatever they want to do. But sometimes they do come up with some very impractical ideas just to be consistent. So sometimes we did have to say no to some of the.
And can you just tell us why was her idea so silly?
Oh yeah. So for example, like the sick leave, actually just maternity leave, each city has different rules. Like in Shanghai, it's pretty much 12 months. In Beijing, it's 12 months. But in some of the cities, it's maybe only 6 months. But they actually have different details. So if you want to apply the same rule to every city, so whatever you propose will be in addition to whatever the local government offers. So whatever you propose cannot replace the local rules. So whatever you propose, you put in writing, it's just in addition to the local rules. So this will enable some of the people can take 1.5 years maternity leave. So some of the things like sick leave, those kind of things, and also there are a lot of things like US company in China has statutory paid holiday. So based on the Chinese rules, an employee, they are entitled to something like, for example, 10 days paid leave. The 10 days is actually based on the number of days is based on your total years of services, including your years of services at this company, plus your years of services at your previous company. But some US manager came to us to say, oh, we offer 25 days in the US. We want to offer 25 days to our employees in China, which is good. Then we say, okay, that at least we need to know there's the compulsory paid leave days, for example, like 10 days. So we can say, okay, in the employment contract, we can say 10 days is mandatory. The extra 15 days is optional. Then because for the mandatory days, if they don't take the leave, they are subject to 3 times of compensation. But for the company optional paid leave, you don't have to pay anything. So when employee take leave, you have to let them take the mandatory leave first. Then they will take the optional so that you don't have to pay 3 times compensation. We actually make those very clear to our clients. Most of them are US companies. Most of them just think, oh, it's too complicated. We don't do that. In the US, we offer 25 days. Our system, our HR system is set in a way to record how many days. We don't want to change our HR system to accommodate whatever the Chinese rules. So even if we advise them clearly, they still don't want to do it just for the reason of simplicity. This happens a lot.
Yeah, I'm guilty of having done that in my career. I know. So
perhaps you never know because nobody told you so, because they don't tell you so because it's just too complicated to manage. And also it's different from your system in the US. So you don't want to do that. But if you want to deep into deeper, you do have a lot of ways to save money. But you know, you have to dig in. For whatever reason, you just don't want to know that.
Right. Okay. So we're getting where we should. You know, I don't know. I've checked if there's questions coming in, but we're getting near audience Q&A time. Before we do that, just one quick question, maybe from both of you, is employment contracts. So we hear that term. Obviously, if at will in America, we don't usually have employment contracts, I guess, but in China, they're fairly common. Are they required? Are they, you know, necessary? Are they enforced?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So in employment contract in China is a must. So if there's actually there are penalties for not signing a written employment contract. And also it seems very easy, but in reality, when it comes to renewal, it's a little bit difficult to manage because some of the employees, when they are very confident about their job, they actually it's an employee who refuse to sign written contract because they want to take this opportunity to bargain for more pay rise. So in theory, it's very simple. Everything has to be in writing, but in reality, sometimes actually it is taken advantage by some of the employees. But and the employment contract, one thing interesting is that one of the essential items on the employment contract is the employee's ID number, which shows his or her age. So age is something that they must disclose at the time of signing the contract.
Which of course in the US we don't ask for, right? Right.
You don't ask for.
Yeah, we don't ask for it. Right.
Yeah. So and also interesting. Another thing is China actually treat local Chinese and foreigner differently. I'm not sure whether you know that. Foreigners, for example, like when you were in China, perhaps you didn't sign a local Chinese employment contract, right? Perhaps you signed a secondment letter. You were still subject to your employment relationship was still with your US company, but you were second to China. But in general speaking, so when you're a foreigner working in China, one option is you can sign an employment contract with your local employer, and the employment contract can be protected. You can choose to be protected by the Chinese law, and also you can choose not to be protected by the Chinese law. So the employment contract pretty much can say termination at will because you are a foreigner. And also you can choose not to sign employment contract. You can just say, okay, I maintain my employment relationship with my US employer. I just sign a secondment letter with a Chinese company to get my visa. So there are different ways of doing that. But generally speaking, foreigners can be treated differently in China.
And Grace,
I think I've run out of time.
No, but do companies, I mean, do any companies in the US have employment contracts?
Normally, written employment contracts are not required. And when there's no written employment contract, it's presumed the employment relationship is at will. It's different for unionized environment, though. There, the collective bargaining agreements serve as employment contract. But there are some agreements related to employment that are typically in writing in the US, such as confidentiality and proprietary information agreement, commission agreement, and retention agreement, and oftentimes executive agreements, which can or cannot. I mean, it doesn't have to alter the at-will employment, but usually talks about what the what the executive will get when there's a termination. Usually there's a severance pay, and just something to throw out there. And because of the Washington's new statute, Silence No More, companies need to be extra careful about just anything. I mean, it could be even in the offer letter, about the confidentiality provisions and non-disparagement agreement. because if there's no carve out that allows the employee to basically talk about what they believe to be unlawful activity in the workplace, or it could be outside but related to work, such as sexual harassment. And it's a strict violation. It's $10,000 per violation. So that's a strict liability there for the employers.
Right.
I wanted to be brief on this one.
Okay, good. So Yuping, you and I talked about this before, and there's a question about age limit for US expats working in China.
Right.
So our questioner says, that I heard 60 was the limit, but are there ways to work around it, like setting up a woofie or something? Or, yeah, can you address that a bit?
So if the renewal is not subject to the 60 years old, but you can get special approval if you are the owner or the legal representative of woofie, of any of the Chinese companies, even a joint venture. Actually you can get approval. And also the one way we had a case where actually the application was rejected in Beijing, but somehow we got approval in Shanghai. So
and just for our listeners, so they understand this, if you're a foreigner working in China and you want to renew your visa and you're over 60,
you can still do it because it's renewal.
But I do have friends that were not able to. So
yeah, this year's, because of the US-China relationship, things started to get tense. I had experienced a 40-year senior manager was rejected his visa renewal.
40 years in China?
40 years, no, 40 years old senior manager was rejected his visa renewal. So the rejection happens, but perhaps not because of the age, but because of something else. Yeah.
Understood. Right. And
I try a different city. Sometimes it works.
Yeah. Another, just a comment. Someone said, "What maternity leave in Shanghai? Did you say it's 12 months?"
And actually, pretty much 12 months. Because actually the standard is already I think 7 to 8 months. Then if you give birth after you are 23, I think you get extra. And then if you have something like succession, you got 2 months extra. But all things add up. So people can take 1 year maternity leave and full pay.
Okay. As you said, there's a lot of detail in Chinese law that can affect employees. Yeah.
So, and also the sick leave in China is pretty long. Actually, employee, as long as they have 1 year, 1 year service with you, they are entitled to 3 months. So 3 months out of 1 year.
Wow.
Yeah, they can take sick leave.
Right.
But actually, so the even the vacation days and various type of leave, and China is not the worst. I mean, there are many countries, especially in Europe, that have much longer leave or vacation days. But it's the thing that Yuping mentioned. For example, maternity leave in China is fully paid, and that's a huge difference. Not all the other countries that offer generous statutory leaves, and they're usually not fully paid, so that adds a lot of burden on the employer's part. Definitely.
Right. So folks on the call, that we were not seeing many questions. I mean, I think personally this is a pretty interesting topic. But please, we got another 10 minutes or so. So please send in your questions. Yuping, I wanted to ask one thing. I had a friend who was a very senior, like almost the CEO of a big Chinese private company. And in the beginning, it was great. But then after a while, he recognized that they wanted him to sign off on stuff, et cetera, that he said he had no control over. And he could have been liable for criminal penalties or things been fine. So in the end, he had to walk away from the job because he just said the risk was too big. So is there a difference there in China between the US about these types of things?
Yeah, actually, in the US, you have the business judgment rules, but in China, that basically does not exist. And also in China, we have direct and officer liability insurance. In China, even if they have, but in terms when it comes to state-owned companies and private companies, when it comes to local PSB investigation, they totally disregard those things. And yeah, there's so many internal complicated relationships inside the state-owned companies. They actually, it's very easy for them they have a small group, but you don't know because you're outsider. So as I mentioned to you, just in the business setting, we are now talking about private life. We just talk about business setting. I actually have two US citizens who are working for Chinese companies. They were interviewed by FBI. And also I had one case where I worked on it for 2 years. A very senior a US citizen working for a Chinese company was house arrested in small city in China. Because actually he did nothing wrong, just because his company's product caused some harm to other people. But you know, as a senior manager, he's far away from the workshop that produced that product. But he was one who was house arrested for the so-called assistant in investigation. That cost his job, cost his reputation. Yeah, this kind of thing happens. So basically, I personally think it's very risky. Some of the people, they accept the job just for the purpose of getting some extra pay before their retirement, but they actually never realized they could get themselves into big troubles, either because of political issues or because the fighting between some of the private companies in China, or even fighting between certain individuals in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, that's the laws, if they're on the books in China, they're not necessarily enforced, and it's a much more, as you say, people to people type relationship, right?
Yeah.
Right. What about, you said earlier about it was easier for a trade union maybe to do a layoff because the unions, I don't know, are recognized by the government. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, that's kind of counterintuitive. In the US here, the union fights against layoffs, but you were saying it's easier for a company with a union to lay off people than a private company.
Exactly. So I had basically 4 or 5 very big layoffs. One of them actually involved almost 300 employees. But the reason one I did, there was about 20 people was involved. So actually we somehow, because we didn't have a trade union, so the massive layoff, we basically could not do massive layoff, even if the law says very clearly we can do it, and also lay off the process, which is basically a filing requirement. But when we talk to the local labor bureau, local bureau say you have to set up a union, then you can do a massive layoff. Otherwise, you can't do it. So yeah, in some cases, with a labor union helps. But the thing is, most US companies, they don't like labor union.
Right.
Yeah, and actually many years ago in Dalian, there was a very famous US manufacturer. They had a trade union in Dalian. At the very beginning, it was very tense because of the US manager. He just felt so hostile to the trade union chair. So we were involved and we talked to the chair. And actually we later learned that the chairman of the trade union was trying his best to help the US manager, which the US manager never realized because he just got the mindset that trade union is bad.
Right. Okay. Well, we have just a couple more minutes. Is there any impact? This is a question for both of you on the more tense U.S.-China geopolitical relationship. I mean, the relationship has gotten worse by the week, by the month here recently. Do you see any impact on employment issues because of that?
Grace, you can go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say you can go first. Well, maybe not. I guess eventually it could lead to some employment issues, but I visited some Chinese clients of the firm in the fall of 2022, and some of them were saying that there was consideration or maybe some sort of directive coming from the Chinese headquarters about maybe exiting the US market, which I felt very sad about. I think, over the years, definitely during the pandemic, the lack of cultural exchange, the greater the misunderstanding is contributing to all of that. Other than that, I'm not sure if I have too much to add.
Yeah, no.
Yeah,
Understood.
I do have two cases where the things are very much different. So I remember many, maybe even 7 years ago, when the US company wanted to either relocate or maybe even close the factory, and the local government was pretty much supportive. As long as you pay severance to your employees, as long as you pay all the taxes due. But recently, actually, I had two clients. They were trying to withdraw from China, pretty much close up everything. It's almost impossible to talk to the local government. So their attitude has changed from previously supportive. Nowadays, they just ignore you.
Yeah. Which is one way of saying no. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it is pretty much no. Yeah.
Right.
And also there's one thing about the Labor Arbitration Commission. For example, in labor arbitration is a must go through process in the US. So Labor Arbitration Commission are controlled by the local government. Previously, I thought they were pretty mutual among employer and employee, but nowadays when it comes to US companies, who is a defendant in a labor arbitration case, I feel, my personal feel is they have totally changed their mind. They just try to do everything to protect employees. Force US company to pay very, very heavy extra severance. Severance.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. No, I think with what's going on, that doesn't really come as a surprise.
Yeah. They don't support.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So we're after 5, so we'll wrap up. I would say for folks on this that have participated, we will send a follow-up email just to let you know how you can see the recording if you want to go back to it. Also, we'll give you the contacts of both Grace and Yuping, because if you do have questions in the future on these issues, you might want to refer to them. So we'll do that. So again, thanks very much to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Right, yeah, and for those of you, the participants, we hope you'll join us on March 7th to hear about the APEC process and what's going to happen in Seattle. Okay, thanks everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.